In the fading light of a desert evening, the wind carried whispers through the cottonwoods that lined the edge of Widow's Creek. Inside a small homestead, a young bride sat by a dim lamp, her wedding ring dull from months of wear and waiting. Her husband had ridden out on a cattle drive that never came back, and the silence since had drawn the wrong kind of attention. From the ridge above, unseen eyes watched, calm, patient, unblinking. The Alpha Apache had been there for weeks, drawn by her quiet courage and the loneliness that hung around her like morning fog. When the Cowboys rode in laughing under the cover of dusk, they believed the night belonged to them. They were wrong. What happens when those who think they hold power meet the one who has already seen death and walked away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning came soft and grey, a slow unraveling of mist that settled over the valley like breath on glass. Mara Kincaid stood at the porch rail, with her hands wrapped around a chipped enamel cup. The coffee inside had long gone cold, but she didn't drink it for warmth anymore. She drank it for the comfort of routine, something to fill the silence that used to be filled by laughter. Boots on the floorboards, a man's low voice humming old trail songs. Inside, the small cabin breathed with memory. Every corner told a story she wished she could forget, but couldn't bring herself to erase. The hand-carved cradle sat beside the cold hearth, its oak grain catching the early light. Her husband had made it in the winter before his final cattle drive, smoothing the edges until they were as soft as his voice had been when he'd promised, "Someday we'll need it." But someday never came. The cradle never rocked a child, only the shadows of dreams that time refused to bury. Mara moved with a quiet precision, the way those who live alone learn to move. Deliberate, careful, conserving strength. She swept the floor, fed the chickens, tended to the small vegetable patch behind the barn. Life reduced to tasks and timekeeping. The world beyond her fences might as well have been another country. At noon, a wagon passed on the trail below. Two men hauling lumber, their faces shaded by hats. One turned to look toward her house, squinting through dust and distance. Mara gave a polite nod, nothing more. In these parts, a woman alone could never be too friendly. Too much kindness invited questions. Too much silence invited trouble. Still, the whispers found her. She knew they did. That she was a widow, maybe not by death, but by abandonment. That she was hiding gold or guilt or ghosts. It didn't matter which story people chose. They all came with the same ending, a woman alone in a house too far from town, with too few friends and too many secrets. By evening, the sky turned copper. The wind carried the smell of mesquite smoke and faraway rain. Mara sat by the hearth, mending a tear in her husband's old coat, though she knew he'd never wear it again. Her needle paused when she thought she heard something. A faint rustle outside, a shape where there shouldn't have been one. She stood, heartbeat quickening, eyes fixed on the window. Nothing, only the hush of night and the sigh of the plains. Beyond the ridge, the one she could see from her back door, someone else was listening too. Taza crouched in silence, his eyes following the flicker of her lamplight through the open shutters. To him, it wasn't the house he watched. It was the woman inside, the way she carried solitude like a wounded animal, but never let it die. Her movements were small prayers of endurance. Her silence, a song he almost recognized. He remembered women of his tribe who had stood just like her, waiting for men who rode away and never returned, keeping the fires alive because hope, even false hope, was still sacred. In Mara's eyes, though he had never looked into them close, he saw the same strength that had once held his world together before war and hunger and loss tore it apart. The sun slipped behind the ridge. The coyotes began their calls, a low wailing that rolled across the plain. Mara closed the door, set the bar in place, and lit the lamp beside the cradle. The light trembled on the wood, as if something unseen stirred within it. She touched its edge gently, whispering, "Good night, my love," as though the cradle itself might answer. Outside, the first stars blinked awake. Taza turned his gaze toward them, whispering words in a language older than the land itself. Words for peace, for patience, for protection. He pressed a hawk feather into the soil before him, a token of watchfulness, and then slipped back into the shadows of the junipers. Inside, Mara blew out her lamp. The darkness folded around her, soft but restless. Somewhere beyond the fence, a horse snorted. A branch cracked. She froze, hand on the rifle propped near the door, but nothing came. Only the long, low sigh of wind brushing through the grass, like footsteps fading into distance. She sat down again, hands trembling just slightly. The cradle rocked once, perhaps from the draught, perhaps from something else, and stilled. In that moment, Mara felt what she would later remember only as a strange kind of calm, like being watched by something that meant her no harm. She didn't know the shape of it yet, or the name, but she felt it in her bones. That night, for the first time in many, she slept without dreaming, and on the ridge above Widow's Creek, the man who had once sworn to never interfere again kept his silent vigil, his eyes tracing the faint glow of her chimney until dawn. The morning came with a brittle wind, the kind that carries both dust and memory. From his perch above Widow's Creek, Taza watched the smoke from the woman's chimney rise in a thin, wavering column. Each morning it was the same, that small sign of life against the emptiness. To anyone else, it might have been nothing. To him, it meant she had survived another night. Taza's world had shrunk to these quiet watchings. The ridge had become his home, his altar, and his punishment. He lived among the rocks and junipers like a ghost of the land, sleeping where the wind carved hollows in the stone. Below him, the creek wound through the valley like a vein of glass, splitting the living from the dead, the settlers on one side, the forgotten trails of his people on the other. He carried no tent, no fire, only a blanket of woven horsehair and a knife older than his memories. Food was caught or gathered, a rabbit snared, wild figs, a bit of cornmeal he bartered for under another name. Each night he traced the stars, mapping them as his grandfather once taught. But now they seemed farther away, dulled by the years of killing that had severed him from the heavens. Taza was not his birth name. The one he'd been given had been buried with his brother beneath a hill scorched by soldiers' torches. Taza meant the Watcher in a tongue few remembered. It had been spoken in jest once by an elder, but it stayed, the only thing that fit after everything else had fallen away. He hadn't meant to find the woman. He'd been moving through the country toward the southern ridge, where the bones of his tribe still lay scattered. But one evening, while following a trail of horse prints, he'd seen her standing in her doorway, framed by the gold light of dusk. A lone woman in white linen, face lifted to the wind, unafraid. Something in that sight had rooted him to the ground. Since then he'd stayed. Days bled into one another, and he learned her rhythms the way a scout learns terrain. When she rose, when she worked, when she prayed. She spoke to no one, though once he saw her wave to a wagon on the road. Her gestures were small but deliberate. Each movement carried a kind of grace, born not of pride, but of quiet endurance. Sometimes he wondered if she sensed him. When she would pause on the porch and look toward the ridge, her eyes narrowed against the sun. He held his breath. There was something ancient in the way she gazed into distance, as if she were waiting for something she no longer believed would come. That morning, Taza found a single hawk feather caught in the grass near his camp. Pale brown and silvered at the tip, it shimmered faintly in the dawn light. He held it between his fingers and felt a strange stirring. Among his people, the hawk was a messenger, a guardian between earth and sky. To leave its feather on a stone meant a promise, to watch, to guard, to act only when the balance demanded it. He placed the feather on the ridge stone overlooking her house, pressing it into the crevice of rock so the wind wouldn't claim it. The gesture was simple, silent, but to him it felt like speaking again after years of silence. As the day wore on, the valley came alive with sound, a distant wagon wheel, the neigh of a horse, the faint clang of tools from the blacksmiths in town. Taza remained still, eyes fixed on the road. He saw the dust trails long before the riders appeared, 3 of them, rough men with slouched hats and rifles across their saddles. They rode without care, laughing too loud for the morning. He watched as they slowed near the woman's property, one pointing toward the porch. Even from this distance, Taza could sense their intent, the way men lean in when they smell weakness. He felt his jaw tighten. They didn't stop that day. They only looked, then rode on toward town. But their glance was enough to awaken the thing inside him he'd buried under years of restraint. The part that remembered how easily life could turn cruel, and how quickly a single act could undo peace. That night, when the stars returned, he sharpened his knife, not in anger but in remembrance. The hawk feather gleamed beside him, catching moonlight like a promise. Below, the woman lit her lamp, and for a moment, their 2 lights, his small fire and her window's glow, flickered in rhythm. As though some old spirit still linked them through the silence, Taza whispered into the wind, not a prayer, but a vow. They will not touch her. He didn't know why he said it aloud. The valley took his words and carried them away, scattering them among the pines. But in that moment it didn't matter. For the first time in years, the watcher had purpose again. The saloon was already half full when the sun dipped behind the ridge. Laughter rolled like thunder against the wooden walls, and the air was thick with tobacco smoke and dust. Men shouted over cards, the piano stuttered through a ragged tune, and the whiskey flowed like a promise that never kept itself. At the center table sat 4 cowboys, each with a grin sharp enough to cut through decency. Their boots were caked in trail mud, their eyes red from sun and mischief. The leader, a broad-shouldered man named Clay Mercer, leaned back in his chair, the whiskey flask glinting in his hand as if it were a badge of something earned. He had the easy confidence of a man who'd been lucky too many times to think luck could run out. "Widow's Creek," Clay said, rolling the words on his tongue like they were something sweet. "That's what they call it?" "Far as I heard," another replied, younger, twitchier. "She's out there alone. Husband never come back from the trail." The third, a grizzled man with a scar that split his lip, snorted. "Happens all the time out here. The men just keep riding." "Yeah," Clay said, eyes narrowing. "But not every man leaves a wife behind on land that rich." The flask passed from hand to hand, each man taking a swallow, as if courage could be swallowed down with liquor. Behind them, the barkeep wiped glasses and listened with one ear, pretending not to. He'd heard this kind of talk before, the sort that started with a laugh and ended with a noose. When the flask came back to Clay, he tapped it against the table and smiled. A woman that lonely's bound to need company. Might be she'd be grateful for a few friendly faces. The men laughed, low and ugly. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, then went quiet. At a shadowed table in the corner, an old trapper looked up from his drink. His eyes met Clay's, and for a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then the old one said softly, "Leave that one be. Ain't no good comes from bothering her." Clay smirked. "You her keeper?" "No," the trapper said. "Just someone who listens to the wind. And the wind says she ain't alone out there." The laughter that followed was cruel and dismissive, the kind men used to drown out fear. But the old trapper didn't flinch. He just picked up his hat and walked out into the dark, shaking his head. By the time the saloon doors swung shut, Clay had already poured another round. The flask gleamed under the lamplight, the liquid inside catching the glow like fire. "Ain't no wind gonna scare me," he said, taking a deep pull. "Ain't no ghost neither." Miles away, on the ridge above Widow's Creek, the same wind hissed through the junipers, carrying the echo of laughter from the town. Taza heard it faintly, like an insult flung at the earth itself. He sat still beside his small fire, hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He'd seen men like those before, swaggering careless, mistaking cruelty for power. The whiskey gave them courage they didn't deserve, and the land punished them for it. Yet even knowing that, he felt the old pull of violence stirring. He told himself it wasn't his concern, that she was not his burden. But as he looked down into the valley, the woman's lamplight flickered again in her window. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and rain. In town, Clay and his men staggered into the street, laughing too loudly, their boots thudding on the boards. The flask swung from Clay's hand like a pendulum, heavy with whiskey, heavier with intent. "We'll ride out come dusk tomorrow," he said, his voice thick with confidence. "Bring her some company. See if that wind's still whispering then." They laughed again, and the night swallowed their voices. Back on the ridge, Taza pressed his palm against the earth, feeling the tremor of hooves somewhere far off. He looked to the east, where the first thin line of dawn had begun to edge the sky. The whiskey flask gleamed in the men's camp below, reflecting the firelight like a spark from something unholy. And as the day began again, the watcher on the ridge whispered to the feather lying beside him, a wordless promise that, if the wind failed to warn her, he would not. The morning broke pale and hollow, the light stretching thin over the horizon like a whisper too tired to speak. Sarah knelt by the garden fence, her hands red with soil, the earth still cool from the night. The autumn wind tugged at her shawl, carrying the dry scent of sage and the faint smoke of distant fires. Her fingers brushed something hard beneath the loose dirt, a glint among the roots. She paused, wiped the soil away, and lifted a small locket. Its hinge cracked, its chain snapped clean. When she opened it, the hinge groaned, and there he was, her husband Samuel, in the sepia light of memory. His face blurred now by dust and time, but his eyes still kind, still full of that quiet certainty he carried into every storm. She pressed the locket to her lips, eyes closed. "If you're out there," she whispered, "find your way home." The sound of hooves startled her. She turned sharply, hand gripping the shovel like a weapon. But it was only young Jacob, a boy from the settlement, riding up the trail with a sack of grain and a nervous look. "Mrs. Crane," he said, tipping his hat. "Brought what you asked for," she nodded, taking the sack. "Thank you, Jacob. Tell your mother I'll send back her tin tomorrow." He hesitated, eyes darting toward the ridge. "Ma says you ought to keep the doors locked at night. There's some men been talking rough down at the saloon." Sarah's heart stilled. "What kind of talk?" "Don't know, just bad kind." She forced a small smile. "I'll be careful." When the boy rode off, she stood there in the wind, the broken locket clenched in her hand. The world felt suddenly thinner, as if every sound was being watched by something unseen. Up on the ridge, Taza watched the boy ride away. His hawk eyes traced the curve of the trail until the dust settled. He'd seen the locket fall from the woman's porch weeks ago, when she'd stumbled through her chores in grief. He hadn't meant to leave it lying there, but perhaps it was better that she found it now. He shifted his gaze to the horizon, where a storm was brewing. The wind had a different scent today. Whiskey and danger, the kind that clings to men before they do something cruel. At dusk, Sarah lit her lamp and set it by the window as she always did. A small act of faith in a world that had stopped answering prayers. She cooked her supper. A simple stew, but couldn't bring herself to eat. The locket sat on the table beside her, its cracked hinge glinting in the lamplight. A noise outside, faint, deliberate, froze her mid-breath. She turned toward the window. The wind had picked up, brushing the grass in strange rhythms. But beneath it, she could swear she heard voices, low and laughing. Sarah snuffed the lamp. The silence that followed was heavy. She stepped softly to the door, listening. On the ridge above, Taza's horse stirred. He felt it too, that unnatural stillness before a trespass. He rose, hand on his bow. The moon had not yet climbed the sky, and the valley lay in darkness, save for the faint glow of a single window at the homestead below. He moved like a shadow, down through the brush, the feather in his hair fluttering once before settling. Every sound from the valley, the murmur of insects, the crack of a branch, told him where they were. 4 men, moving slow, circling. At the house, Sarah backed toward the stairs, clutching the locket like it could protect her. She thought of Samuel, how he'd always leave the lamp on for her when he rode home late. She thought of the way he'd laugh at fear, saying, "The land always watches out for its own." Outside, a hand brushed against the window pane. A whisper followed. "Evening, missus." Sarah's heart slammed in her chest. Then before she could scream, a sound cut through the dark, sharp, clean, unmistakable. The twang of a bowstring. A man's cry shattered the stillness. Another voice shouted, "What the hell?" Taza's arrow had found its mark, in the shoulder of the one nearest the door. The others spun in confusion, but all they saw was darkness and the glimmer of a ridge where no man should have been. The horses scattered. The men swore and fired blind into the night. Bullets whining through trees. Sarah dropped to the floor, breath ragged, clutching the broken locket to her chest. Outside, the Alpha Apache vanished into the junipers, silent as mist. The whiskey courage was leaking from the Cowboys' veins now. They cursed and stumbled back to their saddles, dragging their wounded friend. When the dust settled again, the only sound left was the wind whispering through the grass and Sarah's heartbeat, still echoing like a drum of survival. She looked down at the locket, its hinge broken but still holding together. Somehow that felt like a promise. The dawn came slow, heavy with the scent of rain and gunpowder. Mist clung to the valley, turning the world into a ghost of itself. Sarah stood at her porch, her shawl wrapped tight, staring at the broken fence where the men had been. The soil bore the scars of hooves and boot prints, some shallow, some deep, all leading away into the dark line of trees. Her heart was still thudding unevenly, a remnant of the fear that had stalked her through the night. She hadn't slept. Every creak of the boards, every gust against the shutters, had sent her eyes darting toward the dawn. But now, with the pale light rising over Widow's Creek, she saw something resting on the porch rail, something that hadn't been there before. It was a single black feather, slick with dew, glinting like obsidian in the dawn light. Sarah reached out slowly. When her fingers brushed it, the air seemed to shift, like the world itself held its breath. She turned it over in her hand, unsure whether to feel afraid or comforted. A raven's feather. Out here that meant something. To the settlers, it was a bad omen, a warning of death. But to others, it was a sign of protection, a spirit that watched from the edge of the world. She looked toward the ridge. The mist there was thick, but she thought she saw movement, a faint fleeting shape before it disappeared into the trees. "Who are you?" she whispered. Her voice carried softly, swallowed by the distance. Inside, she set the feather on her windowsill beside the locket. The two artifacts, one from her husband, one from a stranger, felt like anchors in a life that was beginning to drift toward the unknown. By midday, Sheriff Coyle rode up the trail, his horse splattered with mud. He was a broad man with grey whiskers and a face that looked carved from the same stone as the hills. He swung down and tipped his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Crane. Got word from the boy. Said something happened out here." Sarah nodded, her voice low. "They came last night. 4 of them. Thought they could scare me, maybe worse." He frowned. "You see their faces?" "No, but one screamed." "I think he was hurt." The sheriff crouched by the fence, his eyes sharp despite the years. He saw the blood stain in the dirt, fresh and dark. "You shoot one." Sarah hesitated. "No, someone else did." He looked up. "Someone else?" She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting toward the ridge. "I didn't see him, but I know he was there." "He saved me." Coyle followed her gaze. The ridge loomed wild and silent. Could have been a hunter, or one of the Apache scouts from the reservation. Sarah's fingers tightened around her shawl. He wasn't just passing through. He was watching, the sheriff grunted, uneasy. "Well, whoever he was, you owe him your life. But I'd keep your doors barred. Men like those don't give up easy." When he left, she lingered on the porch. The feather gleamed in the sunlight, and she thought again of that shadow in the mist. Somewhere out there a man was watching her, not out of malice, but something else. Something wordless. Up on the ridge, Taza stood with his bow across his back, the wind pulling through his hair. He watched her as the sheriff's horse dwindled down the trail. The feather was gone from where he'd left it. That meant she had found it, and understood he wasn't supposed to interfere. His people had their own burdens, their own lands to guard. But something about her solitude, the way she moved with quiet strength, refusing to break, had rooted him here. The wound he'd left in the cowboy's shoulder would heal wrong if the man survived. It was a clean shot, meant to warn, not kill. Yet Taza knew warnings rarely worked on men drunk with cruelty. They would come again. He reached into his pouch and took out another feather, this one streaked with white. He held it to the wind, murmuring an old word under his breath, a prayer for the hunted and the brave. That night, Sarah sat by the window, mending the tear in her sleeve where she'd fallen. Her hands trembled still. She glanced often toward the ridge, half expecting to see firelight there. But only the stars glimmered. When she finally went to bed, the locket and the feather lay side by side on the table, symbols of two worlds colliding. In her dreams, she saw the ridge in moonlight and a man standing tall among the junipers. His face was half hidden, his eyes unreadable, yet she felt no fear, only the strange calm of knowing that, somewhere in the dark, someone watched not to harm, but to keep harm away. The wind whispered through the window, soft and steady. The valley, once silent, was now breathing again. The next evening brought thunder, not from the sky, but from hooves pounding through the valley. A storm brewed somewhere far off, its rumble carried on the wind like a warning too late. Clay Mercer rode at the front, his jaw tight, his shoulder bound in a rough sling. The bandage was still stained where blood had seeped through. His men followed close, silent for once, their laughter gone. The whiskey was gone too. So was their easy swagger. "Man, don't shoot at me and live," Clay said, spitting to the side. "Don't care if he's white, red, or ghost himself. He's got to answer." The others grunted in agreement, though none of them looked eager. They'd all seen the shape in the mist that night, the shadow that moved faster than a man ought to. One swore he'd heard a whisper before the arrow flew, a voice that wasn't human, but Clay didn't believe in spirits. He believed in lead, whiskey, and revenge. They rode toward Widow's Creek, the last of the daylight fading behind them. The burned saddle strap hung from Clay's belt, a piece of evidence, a trophy, and a reminder that someone had dared to strike first. Its edges were singed from when his horse had panicked near the firelight, breaking loose in terror. Clay had found the strap smoldering by dawn. The smell of burned leather burned into his mind. Sarah stood by her barn, listening. She could feel the earth tremble before she saw them. Her hands tightened around the lantern, the small flame inside trembling like her breath. The raven feather still sat on her window ledge, a symbol she clung to now, believing in the unseen watcher who had saved her once. She turned toward the ridge, eyes searching the darkness. "Please," she whispered. "If you're out there." Taza was. He'd been tracking them since they left town, moving silent through the junipers, a part of the land itself. His horse waited higher up the ridge, patient and quiet. He could smell their anger, hear their laughter turn to muttering. He knew what they intended before they did. The moon broke through the clouds, pale and sharp. It glinted on metal, rifles, spurs, and the buckle of Clay's belt. Taza drew his bowstring back until it hummed like a held breath. His aim rested not on Clay's heart, but on the oil lamp one of the men carried. When the arrow struck, the world turned fire. The lamp shattered, spilling flame across the dry grass. Horses screamed and bucked, and men cursed as heat swallowed the night. The fire ran wild, chasing the wind down toward the creek. Sarah saw the glow rise and froze, her mind torn between fear and understanding. She ran to the barn, flinging open the doors to free the animals. The cows thundered out, the smell of smoke thick and sharp in the air. From the ridge, Taza moved swiftly, cutting through the smoke like a ghost. He loosed 2 more arrows, each finding its mark, one striking a rifle clean out of a cowboy's hands, another slicing the reins of Clay's horse. The beast bolted, dragging Clay hard to the ground. "Show yourself, you coward!" Clay roared, scrambling to his knees, but there was no answer. Only the fire and the whisper of the wind through the junipers. Taza watched, unmoving. He could end it now, 1 arrow and the man would fall. But something in him hesitated. This wasn't his justice, not yet. He turned away as the fire spread, the valley glowing red below. By dawn, the rain came, hissing over the blackened grass. Sarah walked the edge of her property, her boots sinking into ash. The smell of smoke clung to her dress. She found the burned saddle strap tangled in the fence, its edges curled and black. She picked it up, running her fingers over the scorched leather. Another sign, another warning. She didn't know whether to thank the unseen hand or fear it. That night, she left a lantern burning in her window, not as a plea for help, but as a message, "I know you're there, high on the ridge." Taza saw the glow through the rain and bowed his head. His father had once told him, "Fire can be mercy or vengeance. The man who lights it decides which." He had not decided yet. But the burned strap still hung from Clay's belt, proof that vengeance was already on its way. And no man, no whiskey, and no weapon could turn it aside. The morning after the fire, silence blanketed the valley. Smoke still lingered over Widow's Creek, hanging in thin ribbons that caught the early light. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the pocket watch lying before her. Its brass case was dented, its glass cracked. It had been ticking just yesterday, slow but steady, a small rhythm that reminded her of her husband's heartbeat when he used to hold her at night. Now, the hand stood still at midnight. She ran her finger over the engraved initials, J.C., and felt a weight press into her chest. She'd found it near the barn door, half buried in the mud after the fire. Maybe the heat had stopped it. Maybe something else outside. The world seemed to wait. No birds, no wind. Just the creak of the front gate where the men had come once before. When she looked up, Sheriff Coyle was riding down the trail again, his face grim. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching over the damp earth. "Fire spread fast," he said, glancing toward the blackened slope. "Found 2 horses dead in the ravine. One man burned bad, might not make it." Sarah swallowed hard. "Was it Clay Mercer?" "Not yet," he said. "He's still out there. Angry as a hornet from what I hear. Says the ghost that shot him set the fire." She looked down at the pocket watch again. Maybe the ghost was only trying to stop something worse. Coyle's eyes narrowed. "You talk like you've seen him." "I haven't," she said. "But I feel him, watching, protecting." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Be careful what kind of faith you keep, Mrs. Crane. Sometimes protection comes with its own price." After he left, Sarah stood for a long while at the window. The ridge was hidden by mist again, the same soft grey that seemed to veil truth from understanding. She turned the watch over and listened for a sound, any sound, but it stayed still, dead quiet. That stillness echoed in her heart. By afternoon, she took the watch and walked down to the creek. The air was cool, the scent of wet earth rising with each step. She crouched by the water and let the current wash over her hands, then dipped the watch into it as if trying to bring it back to life. Across the creek, she thought she saw a figure, tall, motionless, half-shrouded by trees. Taza had been there since dawn. He watched her kneel, the golden glint of the broken watch catching his eye even from the distance. He knew the object well. He had seen her husband wear it once, long ago, before the cattle drive that never came home. That memory came like a shadow, unwanted but clear. He had known the man. Not well, but enough. They had crossed paths when soldiers raided Taza's camp years ago. Her husband had been there, one of the riders, but he had done no harm, only tried to stop the bloodshed before it began. That mercy had not gone unnoticed, and now the man's widow was paying for a world's cruelty he had tried to temper. Taza's hand brushed the small pouch at his side. Inside it was something old, a piece of copper wire shaped into a ring, a relic from his mother's people. He had meant to leave it once the danger passed, as a final sign that the watcher had moved on. But now, as he watched her hold the broken watch to her chest, he knew the time for leaving had not yet come. In the distance, thunder rolled again. Not fire this time, but rain. Heavy, drenching rain that washed the last of the ashes from the valley. By nightfall, Sarah sat by the hearth, the watch resting beside the feather and the locket. 3 pieces of her life now bound by unseen threads. One from love, one from loss, and one from mystery. She wound the key, though she knew it would not tick again. She whispered, "If you can hear me, if you were sent by him, tell me why." The wind sighed through the cracks in the window, soft and low. It almost sounded like an answer. Up on the ridge, Taza turned his gaze toward her light, faint and golden through the rain. His father's words came again. There are debts that pass through blood and wind. Maybe this was one of them. The pocket watch, silent and broken, marked not the end of time but the beginning of truth. Somewhere between the ridge and the homestead, time itself had stopped waiting and started listening. The rain fell for 2 days straight, turning the dirt road to mud and the creek to a swollen, restless current. Sarah spent most of that time indoors, sorting through what little she still owned. The fire crackled low, her fingers stiff with the damp. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a way to keep her mind from circling back to fear. It was while she was clearing the small chest at the foot of her bed that she found the torn piece of parchment folded into the lining. The edges were brittle and darkened, the ink faded by years of dust and neglect. She thought it was a letter at first, but when she smoothed it flat on the table, she saw the faint sketch of the valley, the creek, her homestead, and beyond it, a narrow trail winding into the ridge. Her husband's handwriting was clear in the corner. Trail to Mesa Ridge. Keep hidden. Sarah's breath caught. Her husband had never spoken of such a trail. In all their years together, he'd said nothing about going near the Apache lands, nothing about the ridge that most settlers avoided out of respect or fear. But there it was. His mark, his words. She ran her finger along the inked path. The trail led past Widow's Creek, across a dry wash, and ended in a small circle drawn beside what looked like a symbol. An arrowhead, perhaps, or a mountain. She couldn't be sure. Questions stirred like ghosts. Had he gone there before the cattle drive? Had he met someone? Buried something? By evening, she decided. She took her shawl, the lantern, and tucked the map into her apron. If her husband had left something out there, she needed to know what. Maybe it held answers, not just to his disappearance, but to the strange presence that seemed to hover over her life since. The trail was slippery underfoot, the rain still whispering through the grass. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, a scent both clean and ancient. She followed the creek first, then crossed where the rocks broke the current. Her boots sank into the mud, but she pressed on, lantern swinging beside her. Above, the ridge rose like a dark wall. Halfway up, she paused to catch her breath and saw movement. A figure stepped from behind the junipers, tall and still. She froze, her hand tightening on the lantern handle. Taza didn't move closer, but neither did he vanish this time. The firelight from her lantern brushed his face enough for her to see the calm in his eyes. He carried no weapon in his hands, only the steady presence of someone who belonged to the night. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his voice deep and even, like water moving over stone. "I found this," she said, holding up the folded map. "My husband's, it leads here." He looked at it, then back at her. "Yes, he came once, long ago," her heart twisted. "You knew him?" Taza nodded slowly. "He helped my people once, when others would not. Saved 2 children from soldiers who came to burn what was left of our camp. He told me to leave the valley that night. Said he would make sure no harm followed." Sarah's voice trembled. "And did he?" Taza's silence said enough. "He never came back," she whispered. "I know," he said. "He died protecting a promise." The rain softened to a drizzle, and the two stood in the hush between wind and memory. Taza pointed to a cluster of rocks higher up the slope. "He left something for you. Said you would come one day, if the world turned dark enough to force your steps here." Sarah followed him, her lantern cutting a thin path of light through the mist. Behind the rocks lay a small leather pouch, weathered but intact. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a folded note and a strip of blue cloth, the color of the ribbon she'd worn on their wedding day. The note, written in her husband's hand, read, "If you find this, it means the debt I owed is paid. Do not fear the man on the ridge. He is your shield now, as I once was." Tears blurred the ink as she read. Taza turned his gaze toward the valley below, his expression unreadable. "He kept his word," he said. Sarah clutched the pouch to her chest. "Then so will I. No one else will take from this land what he tried to protect." For the first time, she saw something soften in Taza's face. a quiet respect. The rain stopped, leaving only the sound of dripping leaves and the slow rhythm of their breathing. When she descended the ridge, she no longer felt alone. The torn map stayed with her, a bridge between past and present, husband and protector, and on the ridge, Taza watched her lantern fade, knowing the trail between their worlds was no longer hidden. The wind had shifted that morning, dry, sharp, restless. Sarah knew a storm was coming long before the clouds began to roll over the ridge. She had risen early to stoke the fire, trying to drive the chill from the cabin walls. But the hearth burned low no matter how much kindling she fed it, while shifting a loose stone to clear the ash. Her fingers brushed something soft, then damp. At first, she thought it a scrap of cloth lost to time, but when she drew it free, her stomach turned cold. It was a handkerchief, once white, now the deep, mottled color of rusted iron. Someone had folded it neatly before tucking it into the hollow beneath the hearthstone. The smell hit her next. Old blood and tobacco, her husband's tobacco. Sarah sank onto the floorboards, the cloth trembling in her hands. She'd sewn those edges herself years ago, initials embroidered into one corner. J.C. She traced them now, her mind spinning. Why would he hide it here? A dozen thoughts chased one another through her head. He could have injured himself. He could have been attacked. But the handkerchief was too soaked, too deliberate. Someone had taken time to clean around it, as though wanting it hidden, not forgotten. The door creaked suddenly. Sarah spun, clutching the handkerchief. Taza stood there, rain dripping from his shoulders, eyes catching the firelight. He had come silently as always, though his presence felt less like intrusion and more like the turning of a page already written. "You found it?" he said. Her voice faltered. "You knew?" He nodded once, stepping closer. "He bled here. The night he returned from the ridge." Sarah's throat went dry. "Who did this to him?" Taza's gaze lowered to the hearth. "Not my people. Soldiers. Men who hunted for the silver vein your husband refused to claim. They wanted him to lead them to it. He would not." The world tilted. "Silver? There's no silver here." "There was," Taza said quietly. "Your husband found it first, but he swore it belonged to no one. He knew what greed would do if word spread. He chose silence." She swallowed hard, staring at the dark stains that had long since dried. "He hid it from me. He hid it from everyone." Outside, thunder rolled over the valley, distant but growing. Sarah felt as if the air itself had changed, something older and heavier now, sitting in the corners of the room. She thought of the map, the ridge, the pouch with its blue ribbon. Pieces of a truth she hadn't wanted to see were falling together at last. "Why tell me now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Taza took a slow breath. "Because the men who killed him have returned." The words fell like a blade between them. "They rode through the southern pass at dawn," he continued, "looking for what they think he left behind." Sarah stood, gripping the blood-stained cloth. "Then they'll find nothing but bones." Taza's expression didn't change, but there was something fierce and approving in his eyes. "You will not face them alone." She met his gaze, firelight flickering between them. "I won't run either." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "He once said you had the heart of the mountain, quiet until broken and then unstoppable." Her lips trembled. "He said that?" "Yes, and he was right." The storm broke overhead, rain hammering the roof, lightning slicing through the sky. Sarah pressed the handkerchief into her pocket and moved toward the window. In the distance, across the wet field, torchlight flickered. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving slow, careful. "Where's your rifle?" Taza asked. "Under the bed." He gave a nod. "Then tonight we guard what he died for." They worked in silence, sealing the shutters, stacking wood, dousing the lanterns. The smell of wet earth mixed with smoke until the air grew thick enough to taste. Sarah felt no fear now, only the strange calm of someone whose grief had hardened into purpose. When the hoofbeats finally reached the yard, she was ready. The men called out, voices slick with whiskey and arrogance. "Evening, missus. We're looking for what your man owed us." Sarah said nothing. One of them tried the door. It rattled but held. Then came the crash of boots, the snarl of curses. Taza waited until they were close before he moved, a shadow against the rain, silent as wind through grass. The first man fell without a sound. The second fired blindly, the flash of his gun lighting his own terror. Sarah raised her rifle, steady hands despite the thunder shaking the walls. When it was done, the rain washed everything clean again. She stood at the threshold, looking at the bodies being carried away by the storm, and felt something in her chest uncoil. The blood-stained handkerchief, still warm in her pocket, no longer felt like a wound, but a seal, a promise honored. Behind her, Taza said quietly, "He can rest now." Sarah turned toward him, her face pale in the flickering light. "No," she said. "Not yet." Outside, the thunder rolled again, but this time she did not flinch. Dawn came soft and gold over the valley, yet it brought no peace. Smoke still hung low across the meadow, where the bodies had been dragged into the rain-soaked ravine. Sarah hadn't slept. She sat at the table, fingers tracing the outline of the handkerchief that now rested beside the silver locket she'd found wedged under a loose floorboard after the fight. The locket wasn't hers. When she opened it, the hinge groaned, a whisper of years. Inside, behind the glass, was a woman's face, young, strong, eyes fierce with life. Her dress was plain, her hair tied back in the way frontier women wore it when they had work to do. But what caught Sarah most was the symbol carved faintly into the metal behind the clasp, an Apache glyph for eternal watch. She looked up at Taza, who stood near the door, sharpening a knife with the steady rhythm of someone trying to think through pain. "This belonged to her," she said softly. He stopped. "To who?" "The woman in the picture." "She looks like—" Sarah hesitated. "Like someone you knew." He moved closer, his expression unreadable. When he saw the symbol, his hand froze. "My mother," he said at last. Sarah's breath caught. "Then how did it end up here?" Taza took the locket gently, thumb brushing over the dent. "My father gave it to her when they met. She kept it until the raid on the southern ridge. When I was a boy, I thought it lost forever." Sarah frowned. "Your father was Apache?" He shook his head. "Half white, half blood of the Chiricahua. A man between worlds, never belonging to either." The room grew still. The fire had burned down to coals, each one pulsing faintly red, like the last heartbeats of the night. Sarah whispered, "Your father, he was a rancher." Taza nodded once. "He rode for the same man your husband once did." His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. They were brothers in all but name. The truth sank heavy. The missing cattle, the silver, the rumors of betrayal, it all began to knot together in Sarah's mind. "Then your mother must have known him too." "She did," he said. "She was the one who nursed him when fever took him the first time. They fought the same men who came back here last night." Sarah's gaze dropped to the blood-stained handkerchief. "Then they never stopped hunting." "No," Taza said, "and they won't stop now. The storm washed away their tracks, but others will come looking. The silver vein runs deeper than anyone guessed. The valley will not stay quiet." For a moment, silence filled the cabin, thick, breathing silence. Then Sarah stood. "Then we go to it first," he frowned. "The ridge?" She nodded. "You said that's where he died." "I need to see it. I need to see where it ended." Taza's jaw tightened. "It's not a place for mourning. The land there remembers blood. Then it remembers him," she said. "And I will too." They rode out before the sun fully cleared the hills. The trail wound between red cliffs and juniper groves, every step of the horse sinking into damp earth that smelled of rain and iron. By mid-morning, the ridge appeared ahead, sharp, grey, silent. At its base, half buried beneath a tumble of stones, lay the remains of a small campfire, long cold. Nearby, a leather strap peeked from the soil. Sarah knelt, brushing dirt aside, until she uncovered what looked like a fragment of a saddlebag. Her husband's initials faintly burned into the leather. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Taza stood watch on the ridge above, scanning the valley. "He fought hard," he said. The men who came for him didn't expect resistance. Sarah's eyes drifted toward the rocks. "He died alone." "No," Taza's voice lowered. "My mother found him. She was too late to save him, but she buried him here with the locket." Sarah touched the dented silver piece, her voice breaking. Then she gave it back to the earth, he nodded. And now it has returned to you. For a while neither spoke. The wind hummed low through the canyon, carrying a faint echo of something older. Song or sorrow, it was hard to tell. Finally, Taza said, "When the riders come again, they will not look for peace. They will look for claim." Sarah closed the locket and slipped it into her pocket. "Then they'll find none. This land belongs to the dead now, and to those who remember them." He watched her, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "You speak like a warrior." "I speak like a wife who's done waiting," she said. The clouds began to gather once more above the ridge, casting the valley in a dull silver light. Somewhere below, a hawk circled, sharp and patient, the way Taza always watched from the distance. He turned his horse toward the trail. "There's something else you should see before the next storm hits. Something your husband left behind in the canyon." Sarah took one last look at the ridge before following. The ground beneath her feet felt different now, less like soil and more like memory. She could almost hear her husband's voice carried in the wind, calm and low, as if approving her choice to stay standing. The locket pressed against her heart as she rode. Its weight neither curse nor comfort, but a key, a promise that the valley's story was far from over, and that its ghosts still had something left to say. By late afternoon, the light turned copper across the canyon walls. Taza and Sarah stopped at a bend where the wind funneled down like a whisper from the gods. He dismounted first, scanning the shadows. "This is where he left it," he said. Sarah followed, her boots crunching over gravel. "Left what?" Instead of answering, Taza crouched by a flat stone, pried it up, and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. When he unrolled it, a strip of hide fell open. A hand-drawn map, stained dark at one edge. Sarah frowned. "That's blood," he nodded. "Your husband's." Her breath caught. The map showed a network of gullies and ridgelines beyond the known trail, a path that looped around Widow's Creek toward something marked with a single word: burial. Sarah's voice trembled. "He found the vein." Taza's gaze hardened. "He found more than silver. He found what they buried to keep the mine secret. Men, evidence, and gold taken from Apache ground." She stared at the map, fingers tracing the inked lines. "So they killed him to keep it quiet." "Yes," Taza said quietly. "But he tried to tell someone. That's why this map exists. He marked the way not for greed, but to make sure truth wouldn't stay buried." Sarah closed her eyes. "He wanted me to find it." Taza rose slowly, the wind lifting his hair. "He wanted someone he trusted to carry what he could not." The canyon seemed to hum with memory, the low, ancient sound of loss echoing through stone. Sarah folded the map, hands steady despite the ache in her chest. "Then we follow it." He hesitated. "It's not a trail for the living. The men who hid their crimes there would rather kill again than let it surface." Sarah met his gaze. "You said once your people believe the land remembers. Then maybe it's time we listen." They set out before the light faded. The map led them deeper into the canyon's throat, where the air grew colder and the sky narrowed to a slit of dying blue. The walls glowed faintly red in the dusk, streaked with mineral veins that shimmered like old scars. Taza rode ahead, every movement deliberate, senses stretched taut. Sarah followed, her mind circling back to the look in her husband's eyes the last time he rode away. Something unspoken, something that made sense only now. When they reached a bend marked with stacked stones, Taza stopped. "We walk from here." The ground was soft underfoot, giving slightly with each step. Sarah noticed pieces of shattered tools, iron picks, broken handles, rusted tin cups half buried in dirt. "This was a camp," she whispered. "More like a graveyard," Taza murmured. They followed the blood-stained path to a shallow hollow, where the earth had caved in over time. Taza knelt, brushing away sand until he uncovered bones, long, pale, nameless. "Apache laborers," he said. "Worked to death, buried with the mine." Sarah's throat tightened. "My husband knew. He tried to expose it," Taza said. "But those in charge were the same men who built this town, who hold the law now." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sarah unfolded the map again, tracing where the lines converged. "Here," she said, pointing to a mark near the bottom corner. There's another word, return. What does it mean? Taza leaned closer, brow furrowing. Return what was taken. Behind them, thunder rolled faintly over the hills. The sky had begun to darken again, heavy with the scent of coming rain. Sarah's eyes softened. Then that's what we'll do. He studied her, the strength in her stillness, the fire in her grief. You go against your own people for this? They stopped being mine when they killed him, she said. And when they left those men here, the first drops fell, pattering on the hide map, washing over the bloodstains that refused to fade. Taza looked toward the ridge. And when the storm breaks, we'll move. There's a cave nearby where we can wait it out. Inside lies something older than this feud, older than both our worlds. Sarah tucked the map safely into her coat. Something your mother knew? He nodded. And something my father died trying to protect. Lightning flashed, revealing the shape of the canyon like an open wound, its depths filled with ghostly light. The thunder came after, deep and rolling. As they climbed toward the cave, Sarah felt the pull of the land in her bones, a hum that matched her heartbeat. Every shadow, every stone, seemed to hold a memory waiting to speak. When they reached the mouth of the cave, Taza stopped, scanning the horizon one last time. They'll come by dawn, he said quietly. The map will draw them too. They always return to what they buried. Sarah turned toward the darkness ahead, where the cave walls glimmered faintly with quartz and time. Then let them come. I've buried enough to know how to dig the truth out. Inside, the rain roared against the cliffs, sealing them in the sound of the storm, a hymn for the forgotten. The cave breathed like something alive. Each gust of wind carried whispers that bent around the stone walls, as if the mountain itself remembered what men tried to forget. Sarah followed Taza deeper inside, her lantern flickering against drawings etched into the rock, spirals, handprints, and the faint outline of a woman holding a pendant shaped like a tear. Taza stopped before it. This, he said, tracing the lines, was my mother's mark, the symbol of balance. Every soul has two paths, one taken, one waiting. Sarah tilted her head. And which one are we walking now? He looked toward her. The one waiting. She glanced down. In the glow of the lantern, she noticed something half buried at her feet. A string of dried sinew, and at its end, the clay pendant from the drawing. It was cracked down the middle, as if broken by time or loss. Taza knelt beside it, reverent. She was here. The air seemed to thicken, filled with quiet awe. Sarah handed him the pendant. Then she wanted it found. He nodded slowly. She must have hidden it when the soldiers came through the canyon. My father said she carried it into every battle, believing it could reveal what was unseen. Sarah brushed a thumb across its surface. Truth. Yes, Taza murmured. Truth and judgment. A low rumble echoed through the cave, thunder from above or something else. Sarah lifted the lantern higher, and its light revealed an opening deeper in, narrow and jagged. The walls inside shimmered faintly, veins of silver running through the rock like trapped lightning. The mine, she whispered. No, Taza said. The heart of it. They stepped closer, boots scraping against stone. At the edge of the chamber lay remnants of old timbers, rusted chains, and a heap of collapsed earth. Half buried beneath was a skeleton, its wrist still bound in iron. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. Dear Lord, Taza crouched. One of the miners. Maybe more. She swallowed hard. This is what they hid. He nodded. And what your husband found. Sarah stared into the hollow sockets of the skull, the silence between her breaths heavy with realization. He died trying to bring this truth home. Taza held up the pendant, its cracked surface glowing faintly in the lantern's light. Now it's your burden to carry. Sarah met his gaze. No, she said softly. Ours. They began to clear the rubble, working until sweat mixed with dust on their skin. As they unearthed more remains, they found fragments of tools, torn scraps of ledger paper, and at last a small box of blackened wood. Taza pried it open with his knife. Inside, under a layer of dried earth, lay rolled papers, ink faded but still legible, names, wages unpaid. The list of men who never came home. Sarah covered her mouth. They documented everything, and buried it all here, he said. She stared at the list. Among the names near the bottom, one caught her eye, Matthew Crane, her husband. Her knees weakened, and she pressed a hand to the wall to steady herself. He was here. Taza's eyes softened. He didn't just die for truth. He became part of it. For a long moment she couldn't speak. The only sound was the rain hammering against the mountain outside, as if the storm itself grieved. Then slowly she lifted the pendant again. Your mother said it shows what's unseen. Maybe it brought us here for this, Taza nodded. It did. But the pendant also warns. Truth demands a price. She looked toward the mouth of the cave, where faint light bled in. Then we'll pay it. He stepped closer. You mean to expose them? Yes, she said, voice steady. Every name, every deed. If they want to silence this canyon again, they'll have to face us first. Lightning flashed, illuminating the entrance for an instant, and with it, the silhouette of riders in the distance. Taza's hand went to his rifle. They've found us. Sarah tucked the papers into her coat, tightening it around her. Then truth comes out tonight. He glanced at her, seeing not fear, but the same fierce calm that had drawn him to her from the ridge weeks ago. My mother would have called you brave, he said. Sarah gave a small smile. Then let's not make her a liar. The pendant swung between them, its crack catching the firelight like a wound that refused to close. Outside, hooves struck rock, slow, deliberate. Closing in, Taza blew out the lantern, and in the sudden darkness, the silver veins on the walls shimmered faintly, as if guiding them toward what came next. The cave held its breath. So did they. The storm broke in full fury that night. Rain fell in sheets, thunder rolling so low it seemed to rattle the bones of the earth itself. In the dimness of the cave, Sarah could hear the hoofbeats drawing nearer, muffled but certain. Taza knelt beside her, blade in hand, the bone handle slick with moisture. This belonged to my father, he said quietly. He used it the night he saved your husband. Sarah's breath caught. Then it's seen both mercy and blood, he nodded. And it will again before dawn. They crouched in silence, the cave mouth glowing faintly with each flash of lightning. Sarah's pulse matched the storm, sharp and unsteady. She could hear voices now, men shouting orders, the jingle of spurs, the thud of boots on wet stone. They mean to burn us out, Taza whispered. Sarah's hand went instinctively to the papers hidden inside her coat. Then we don't give them the chance. He met her gaze, something like pride flickering beneath the tension. You have a plan? Not one I'll survive, she said softly. His expression hardened. You will. I'll make sure of it. Outside, a flare of torchlight cut through the rain. The riders dismounted, half a dozen men, faces shadowed beneath their hats. One called out, voice coarse and mocking, We know you're in there. Come on out, Mrs. Crane. You and that redskin lover both. Sarah's jaw clenched. Taza stood, silent as stone, then pressed the knife into her palm. Hold this. If you must use it, aim for the heart. It never lies. The weight of it steadied her. The bone felt warm, alive even. The men moved closer, torches bobbing like restless ghosts. One tried to climb toward the cave's edge, boots slipping on wet rock. Another raised his rifle, firing into the darkness. The bullet struck stone, ricocheting deep inside the cavern. Taza didn't move until the third man stepped within reach. Then he vanished into the storm, swift, soundless, lethal. Sarah heard the struggle before she saw it, a grunt, a strangled cry, and the sound of flesh meeting rain-soaked ground. The torch fell, sputtering out in the mud. Two more men advanced, cursing, firing blindly into the cave. Sarah ducked behind a boulder, the bone knife gripped tight. Taza reappeared beside her, breath low but steady. They'll rush us next. When they do, run for the ridge. There's a ravine beyond the cedar line. They won't follow there. She shook her head. I'm not leaving you. He gave a faint smile. You sound like my mother. Before she could answer, one of the torches burst against the cave wall, flames licking across dry brush, left near the entrance. Smoke curled thick and black, carrying the stench of burning oil. Sarah coughed, covering her mouth. They'll choke us out. Taza's eyes scanned the chamber. Not if we turn the fire back on them. He pulled a leather pouch from his belt and poured its contents onto the flame. a powder that sparked white-hot, sending a burst of light through the smoke. The men outside shouted, blinded, "Now!" He barked. Sarah ran with him through the narrow exit at the back of the cave. The rain hit her like a wall, cold and sharp, but the air was clean. Behind them, fire roared, feeding on the oil-soaked timbers. They stumbled down a slope slick with mud. Sarah slipped once, but Taza caught her arm before she fell. In his other hand, the knife gleamed briefly in the stormlight, a streak of silver against the dark. Shots cracked behind them, wild, desperate. One bullet tore through Sarah's sleeve. Another struck a tree, sending bark flying. They reached the ravine and dove behind a fallen log. The gunfire ceased, replaced by the sound of shouting and the distant collapse of burning wood. Taza's chest rose and fell heavily. "They'll think we're dead." Sarah pressed her hand to the wound in her arm. "Good, let them." He tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped it around her arm, hands sure and gentle. The warmth of his touch steadied her trembling. After a moment, she looked at the knife still clutched in her hand. "Your father's blade did its duty," he nodded. "It always does when held by one with purpose." The storm began to ease, the rain thinning to a mist. Below, the flames died slowly, leaving only embers glowing red in the darkness. Sarah stared at them, her face pale but resolute. "Tomorrow we ride to town. Those papers go to the marshal. Whatever happens after, the truth will be known." Taza studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "If you do that, you'll lose everything you have left." She met his eyes. "I already did." He didn't argue. Instead, he took the knife back, slid it into its sheath and said, "Then I'll ride beside you." The storm passed, leaving the valley hushed beneath the weight of wet earth and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote cried, a sound of mourning or warning. It was hard to tell. Sarah looked toward the first hint of dawn, creeping along the horizon, and whispered, "It's almost over." Taza's answer came low, steady, and certain. "No, it's only just beginning." The morning sun crept over the hills, soft and gold against the soot-stained earth. Smoke still rose from what had once been the deputy's outpost below, the place where the men who hunted them had gathered. Now only ruin remained. Sarah stood at the ridge, the iron locket resting in her palm. Its surface was cool, etched with years of wear. She had found it among the ashes, the photograph inside untouched by flame, a picture of a young Apache woman with a steady gaze and a faint smile. "Your mother?" she asked quietly. Taza nodded. "The last image ever taken of her." The white photographer traded it for water. Sarah traced the outline of the woman's face with her thumb. "She looks fierce, proud." "She was," he said softly. "She buried 3 sons. And still sang every night so the spirits would not forget us." Sarah closed the locket and handed it back to him, but he didn't take it. "Keep it," Taza said. "She believed memory belongs to the one who carries the story forward." Sarah hesitated, unsure what it meant for her to carry such a thing, a relic of his bloodline, a symbol of all that had been lost and survived. Below, the wind carried the faint clang of a church bell from the town beyond the ridge. The hour was near noon. By now, word of the outpost fire would have spread. "They'll come for us again," she murmured. "They'll come for you," he corrected. "You're the one holding proof. That ledger of land theft, the false signatures, the names of every man who profited from it, your husband included. You bring that into town, and every man wearing a badge will turn his gun your way." Sarah looked toward the valley, jaw set. "Then they'll have to kill me in daylight." Taza studied her for a long moment. "You don't owe them truth." "Not anymore. I owe it to the women who buried sons they never named," she said. "To the land that fed them. To your mother." At that he fell silent. The wind picked up, scattering ash into the grass. They began their descent toward town, moving slow through the ravine where wild sage grew thick. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with the knowing that this day might be their last. Halfway down, Taza stopped and reached for her hand. "If we're separated," he said, "don't run to the church or the square. Go to the blacksmith's behind Maine. There's a wagon there, one with no markings. The driver owes me his life. He'll take you as far as the border." She squeezed his hand. And you? He looked toward the town, where dust already stirred from approaching riders. I was never meant to leave this land. But if I can see you cross that line free, that's enough, she wanted to argue, to tell him that survival meant both of them. But there was no time. The riders crested the far hill, sun flashing on rifles. Go, he said, pushing her toward the rocks. She ran, clutching the locket to her chest. From her cover, she saw Taza draw the men away, darting through the mesquite, firing once, twice, leading them down into the gullies, where the sound of horses echoed and dust rose in chaos. Sarah reached the blacksmith's just as the first shots rang out. The old man looked up from his anvil, eyes widening when he saw her. Without a word, he lifted the tarp from a wagon. "Under here," he whispered. She hesitated. "There's someone still out there." "Then pray for him," the blacksmith said, "because if you stay, you'll damn you both." She climbed in, the heat stifling beneath the tarp. The wagon lurched forward, the steady clop of hooves masking her ragged breath. Through a gap in the canvas, she saw the valley spread behind her, smoke, sunlight, and the faint echo of gunfire. The sound faded slowly. When it was gone, she opened her fist. The locket lay there, warm now from her skin. She pressed it to her heart and closed her eyes. The road turned, and the town disappeared from view. Hours later, when the wagon stopped by a shallow creek, the driver lifted the tarp and said, "This is as far as I go. Mexico's a day's ride from here." Sarah stepped down, her boots sinking into the wet earth. "Did he send word?" The man hesitated, then handed her a folded scrap of paper. "Found this by the wheel after we left." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Only a single sentence was written there in a steady hand. "The land remembers the names carved in its bones." A single tear fell onto the ink, smudging it. She looked toward the horizon where the desert met the sky, an endless stretch of gold and grey, and whispered, "Then remember his too." The locket swung gently against her chest as she mounted the horse left for her. She didn't look back. Behind her, somewhere beyond the ridges and the smoke, the land grew still again. Quiet, watchful, eternal. The desert was merciless at noon, a blinding plain of light and heat. The wagon tracks Sarah followed were already half swallowed by wind, twisting south through thorn scrub and bone-white sand. Every few miles she stopped to listen, half expecting to hear pursuit, half fearing silence. She hadn't seen Taza since the day of the gunfire, but she could still smell the gunpowder in her dreams. The sound of hooves and rifles had become part of her pulse, beating in time with her guilt. By sunset, she reached a shallow canyon marked by a lone mesquite tree. Beneath it lay the remains of a camp, ashes cold, a canteen left open, and beside it, the artifact she would never forget, a bandolier, thick with blood and dust. Her knees gave out when she saw it. She knew that leather, those silver beads woven through the stitching, Apache patterns, Taza's family design. But the insignia burned into the back was cavalry issue, U.S. Army standard. She turned it over with shaking hands, finding his knife sheathed behind it. Inside the grip, carved in careful Apache script, were the words, "Hoju Nahastli." It has become beauty again. For a long time, she sat there under the dying light, staring at that blood-soaked strap. She didn't know if it was a message of peace or farewell. A hawk circled above, its shadow sweeping over her like a ghost's touch. Sarah whispered into the empty wind, "You said the land remembers. So does the heart." When darkness fell, she built a small fire and laid the bandolier beside her. Each bead seemed to glint with its own story, of wars fought, of brothers buried, of the unending cost of survival. She imagined Taza wearing it one last time, standing between her and the rifles aimed from the ridge. The next morning, she rose before dawn and tied the bandolier across her chest. It felt too heavy, as if the weight of 100 years had settled into it. But she wore it anyway, not as armor but as remembrance. Her path took her through a dry basin where cacti bloomed in improbable bursts of red. There, she met the first soul she'd seen in days, a wandering missionary named Brother Callum, driving a mule cart laden with Bibles and bandages. He stopped when he saw her, his weathered face soft with pity. "You look like you've come out of a grave, child." "Maybe I have," Sarah said. He offered water and shade beneath his tarp. She drank slowly, the coolness almost painful. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "South," she said. "Across the line," he looked at the bandolier. "That don't belong to any preacher's child." "No," she said. "It belongs to someone who believed in balance." Brother Callum nodded, as if he understood. The world could use more of that. When they parted, he gave her a small silver cross. "For luck," he said. She accepted it but didn't wear it. Instead, she placed it inside the bandolier pouch beside the Apache knife, a strange marriage of two faiths, both born from suffering. By the third day, the terrain softened. Dusk gave way to dry grass and clusters of mesquite. Ahead, she saw a faint shimmer, the border river twisting like a vein through the sun-baked earth. She reached the water by nightfall. The stars came out sharp and cold, mirrored in the black current. Kneeling at the edge, Sarah removed the bandolier and held it before her. "You carried bullets," she whispered. "Now you carry memory." Then with slow hands, she cut the strap in half. One piece she buried in the sand with Taza's knife, pressing the earth flat above it. The other half she tied around her horse's saddle. "Half for the land," she murmured. "A half for the road ahead." A coyote's cry rose in the distance, lonely, endless. When the moon climbed high, she crossed the river, the water cold around her boots. Each step carried her farther from the valley, from the smoke and the loss, from the ghosts that lingered just beyond sight. But as the current pulled at her, she felt something else, peace, faint but real. Behind her, the desert glowed pale under moonlight, and somewhere beyond those silent hills, the land indeed remembered. The night wind brushed her cheek like a farewell. The wind carried the scent of rain across the plains, whispering through tall grass like soft voices from another life. Sarah sat beneath a cottonwood tree, her horse grazing nearby, the sound of water trickling from a nearby stream. Days had passed since she crossed the border, yet the valley clung to her thoughts like dust to her skin. In her palm rested the locket. She had found it tucked inside her old trunk, left behind in the chaos of that final night. She remembered it hanging around her neck on her wedding day, a gift from her husband. But now it bore another engraving, faintly etched into the back in steady Apache script, Taza. She didn't know how it got there. Perhaps he had found it after the fight. Perhaps he had carried it, believing she might return. The thought pierced her heart in a quiet, enduring way that grief often does, slow, without sound. The rain came suddenly, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on leaves and the brim of her hat. She stayed where she was, letting it wash over her, cleansing the dust and blood that still seemed to cling to her spirit. The land around her shimmered with life again, the scent of wet sage, the sound of frogs, the laughter of thunder rolling in the distance. For the first time in weeks, she felt something shift inside, a recognition that endings aren't always clean, that love doesn't vanish with the body. She opened the locket and looked at the portrait within. Half of it was smeared from moisture and time, but the faint outline of her younger self was visible, smiling with unguarded joy. Beside the image, she tucked a scrap of deerskin, upon which she had written in charcoal, "For the eyes that never stopped watching." When the rain eased, she rode into the next town, a settlement called Las Piedras, quiet and wind-worn, built around an old mission church. The bells rang as she arrived, though it wasn't Sunday. The streets were half empty, just a few traders and children chasing dogs through the puddles. At the edge of town stood a small blacksmith shop, smoke rising from its chimney. She entered, holding the locket in her hand. The man behind the forge was old, his beard grey, his eyes sharp as iron filings. "I need this sealed," she said. He studied the locket. "You want it soldered shut?" "Yes," she whispered. "So it can't be opened again?" He nodded without asking why. When the work was done, he handed it back, the edges smooth, the clasp fused closed forever. "What's inside must mean something fierce to you," he said. "It does," Sarah replied. "It's what's left of who I was and who he was." She left him a silver dollar and rode south again, wearing the locket beneath her shirt, the metal warm against her heart. As twilight fell, she reached a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of red earth and blue shadow. The horizon burned gold, then faded to purple as the sun slipped behind the mountains. She dismounted and stood still, letting the silence wrap around her. For a moment, she thought she saw him, Taza, standing among the rocks below, motionless, watching as he always had. But it was only a trick of the light. Still, she smiled through tears, knowing that some spirits don't need flesh to keep their promises. She whispered into the wind, "I hope the land has made you beauty again." Then she took the locket and hung it from a branch of a mesquite tree, where the last rays of sunset turned it to fire. It swung there gently, glinting like a star caught in twilight. Behind her, the sound of hooves echoed faintly. Perhaps her imagination, perhaps not. She didn't turn to look. Some mysteries were meant to stay behind her, alive only in memory. As night came fully, she made camp beside the ridge, the glow of her small fire flickering against her weary face. The storm had passed. The land smelled alive again. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Tomorrow I'll ride east, but for now..." She listened to the wind, to the whispering trees, to the echo of a voice she would never forget. Dawn broke soft and slow across the desert, the first light spilling over the mesas like a whispered prayer. Sarah rose from her blanket, her breath visible in the cool air, her heart strangely calm. The fire had burned down to ash, and a coyote watched from a distance, curious but unthreatening. She saddled her horse and turned for one last look at the mesquite tree where the silver locket still hung. The sun caught it just right, and for a heartbeat it gleamed like morning starfire. She bowed her head, not in grief but gratitude. Before she left, she took from her saddlebag one final object. The arrow she'd found lodged in her barn wall after that night. The night Taza had come from the ridge and rewritten everything she thought she knew about love and survival. The feathers were weathered now, the shaft cracked with time, but it still carried weight. She walked to the edge of the ridge, where the land fell away into the valley. From there she could see the faint outline of her old homestead far off, just a smudge of grey against the desert floor. Everything that had once defined her life fit inside that distant horizon. Kneeling, she drove the arrow deep into the soil beside the tree. The ground was hard, but it yielded with enough pressure, and the obsidian tip disappeared into the earth. She tied a strip of cloth, part of her old wedding dress, around the shaft. It fluttered in the morning wind, pale against the red clay. "This is where the watching ends," she murmured, "and where remembering begins." For a while, she simply stood there, letting the quiet hold her. She thought of Taza's eyes, the steadiness in them, the way he never asked for anything more than truth. She thought of her husband, Mark, whose disappearance had set this all in motion. Maybe he had died somewhere far from home, or maybe he'd chosen to vanish. Either way, she had made her peace with both ghosts. The sun climbed higher, warming her shoulders. She turned east and began her slow ride toward the horizon. Her shadow stretched long beside her, one woman carrying the memory of two lives, the wife who had waited and the wanderer who had survived. As she rode, the land began to change again. The hard red of the high desert softened into rolling grass, dotted with wildflowers and old stones. She passed a herd of pronghorns, startled into graceful motion, their silhouettes flashing in and out of the rising light. In the far distance, she saw a train track glinting like a dark vein through the plain. Civilization, she thought. Another world waiting. But she didn't speed up. Some journeys aren't meant to end quickly. By midday, she reached an old telegraph post, its wires humming faintly in the wind. She stopped and took a deep breath, the faint metallic scent of rain still clinging to the air. The horizon stretched endlessly before her. She smiled, faint but real. Behind her, the arrow stood alone on the ridge, its crimson thread catching the light. To anyone passing by, it might look like nothing more than an old relic, a forgotten piece of war. But for those who knew, it marked the place where two paths had crossed, one of loss, one of redemption, and found something sacred in the middle. Sarah didn't look back again. Some stories, she knew, live best in the land that bore them. As she rode eastward, the sound of wind and hoofbeats blended into something like music, ancient, steady, eternal. By dusk, she stopped at a small rise overlooking a wide expanse of prairie. She lit a tiny fire and watched the colors fade from the sky. Above her, the stars began to appear, bright, endless, unchanging. In their quiet company, she whispered her final words to the desert, to the spirits, to the man who had watched her when no one else dared. "Walk with me, wherever I go." The firelight flickered across her face, softening the lines of sorrow and turning them into something like wisdom. And somewhere far behind her, the wind rose again, sweeping through the ridge, rustling the feathers of the arrow. One final sound of remembrance, one breath of a story that would outlive them both.